There are 1,000 ways to enforce the Emperor's law in the 41st millennium, but only one punishment that truly matters: death. In the crushing depths of Hive Tertius on the industrial world of Mordian Prime, where 30 billion souls scrape out their miserable existence in vertical cities that pierce the toxic clouds, law and order hang by the thinnest of threads. That thread is black carapace armor, wielded shock mauls, and the unwavering dedication of the Adeptus Arbites. Judge-Marshal Vex adjusted the weight of his suppression shield as he led his patrol through the cramped corridors of sub-level 847. Behind him, 4 arbitrators moved in perfect formation, boots striking the rusted deck plating in synchronized rhythm that had become second nature after decades of service. Their black armor bore the golden eagle of Terra, but down here in the industrial sectors, that symbol meant more than imperial authority. It meant the difference between civilization and the howling madness that lurked in humanity's darkest corners. If you hunger for more tales of imperial justice and the brutal realities of the 41st millennium, hit that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who stand with righteousness against the dark. The morning briefing had been routine. Gang activity in Sector 7 Delta, possible narcotic distribution, suspected weapons smuggling from off-world sources, standard enforcement protocols for a Hive city patrol. Vex had been dispensing the Emperor's justice for 23 years, since he'd graduated from the Shola Progenium as a fresh-faced recruit who still believed in the possibility of rehabilitation. The Underhive had beaten that naive notion out of him within his first month of service. "Movement ahead, Judge-Marshal," reported Arbitrator Thorn, her voice crackling through the Vox speed. She raised her combat shotgun, finger resting alongside the trigger guard with practiced discipline. "Hab block 847 Tertius, multiple heat signatures." Vex activated his Auspex scanner, watching the green-tinted display populate with data. 17 contacts, clustered around what the building schematics identified as a former water reclamation facility. Too many for a standard family unit, too organized for refugees. The pattern suggested lookouts, defensive positions, and a central gathering point, textbook gang structure. "Standard sweep formation," Vex commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades spent bringing order to chaos. "Citizens, we are not here to coddle criminals or debate imperial law. We are here to enforce it. The Emperor judges through our actions, and his verdict is absolute." The arbitrators spread out with mechanical precision. Vex had trained this squad personally, molding them from raw recruits into instruments of justice. Arbitrator Mordek took point with his suppression shield and shock maul. Behind him, Thorn provided range support with her combat shotgun loaded with executioner rounds. Arbitrators Kane and Voss covered the flanks, their riot guns loaded with mass reactive shells that could punch through improvised gang armor with contemptuous ease. As they approached the Hab block entrance, Vex noticed the first signs of organized resistance. Fresh lasburns scarred the walls, too precise for random gang violence, too recent for old territorial disputes. Someone had been expecting trouble, and they'd been preparing for it with military-grade weapons that no civilian should possess. The Judge-Marshal's grip tightened on his power maul. In his experience, when criminals started thinking tactically, it meant something bigger was at work, something that required the full weight of imperial justice to crush. They breached the entrance with textbook efficiency. Flashbang grenades preceded their entry, followed by the thunderous crash of arbitrator boots on corrugated steel flooring. Vex's enhanced auto-senses immediately cataloged the scene. Improvised barricades, weapon caches, and the acrid smell of fear sweat mixed with something else, something that made his 23 years of experience scream warnings. The something else was the smell of ozone and burnt copper that every veteran arbitrator learned to recognize. The smell of illegal psyker activity.
The first gunshot cracked through the recycled air like a whip, muzzle flash illuminating terrified faces pressed against makeshift cover. But these weren't the desperate, poorly armed gangers Vex had expected. These criminals moved with coordination, their weapons fired in disciplined volleys, and their positions had been prepared by someone who understood Imperial military doctrine. "Contact left, Thorne's voice cut through the chaos as her combat shotgun boomed, executioner rounds shredding through a ganger's improvised flak vest. The man dropped, but two more immediately moved to fill his position, tactical discipline that set Vex's teeth on edge. Arbitrator Mordek advanced behind his suppression shield, shock maul crackling with lethal energy. A burst of autogun fire sparked off the reinforced ceramite, and he responded with mechanical precision. Shield bash to stagger, maul strike to the temple to kill. No hesitation, no mercy, no quarter given to those who defied Imperial law. "These aren't street scum," Kane reported over the Vox, his riot gun punching fist-sized holes through a ganger's cover. "Look at their equipment, military-grade photo goggles, coordinated fire patterns, disciplined retreat under pressure." Vex processed the tactical situation while putting las rounds downrange with his bolt pistol. The gangers were falling back toward the water reclamation facility in good order, covering each other's movement and maintaining overlapping fields of fire. Someone had trained these criminals, and that someone understood how the Adeptus Arbites operated. The Judge-Marshal's suspicions crystallized into certainty when he spotted the leader, a massive brute in stolen Imperial Guard flak armor, bellowing orders with the unmistakable cadence of a former sergeant. But it wasn't the man's military bearing that sent ice through Vex's veins. It was the 8-pointed star carved into his forehead, still weeping blood from its recent creation. "Heretics," Vex voxed to his squad, the word carrying all the weight of damnation. "We're not dealing with common criminals, we're looking at active chaos corruption." The distinction mattered more than civilians could ever understand. Gang warfare was a disease, painful, destructive, but ultimately treatable through application of shock mauls and summary execution. Chaos corruption was cancer. It spread through contact, thrived on violence, and turned loyal Imperial citizens into enemies of mankind itself. It required not just justice, but purification. "Judge-Marshal," Thorne called out, her voice tight with professional concern. "The retreat pattern. They're herding us towards something. This isn't random resistance." Vex studied the tactical display on his auspex, watching the heat signatures pull back deeper into the facility. The gangers weren't trying to escape. They were drawing the arbitrators forward toward whatever waited in the depths of the abandoned water plant. Every instinct honed by 2 decades of service screamed trap, but Imperial doctrine was clear. When chaos reared its head, it had to be crushed immediately, regardless of cost. "Advance by sections," he commanded. "Mordek and Kane breach and clear. Thorne and Voss overwatch and suppression fire. We follow protocol, secure, sanctify, execute." They pressed forward through corridors that reeked of more than just industrial decay. The air itself seemed thick with malevolence, and Vex noticed details that hurt to look at directly. Graffiti that hurt to look at directly, shadows that moved independently of their light sources, and a low humming that seemed to resonate in his bones. The former sergeant appeared again, retreating around a corner while laying down covering fire. But now Vex could see what the man had become. Skin mottled with unnatural growths, eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal predator, and movements that flowed with inhuman grace. The chaos corruption wasn't just ideological, it was physical, transforming loyal servants of the Emperor into something that belonged in the warp itself. "Mutation confirmed," Vex reported into his Vox recorder for later evidence review. Subject displays Class Delta corruption markers, initiating Hereticus protocols. The protocols were simple. No prisoners, no interrogation, no attempts at rehabilitation. When chaos touched Imperial citizens, the only cure was death, applied with extreme prejudice and followed by ritual cleansing of the contaminated area. They reached the entrance to the main facility as the last ganger disappeared inside. They could hear them moving deeper into the complex, their voices echoing off pipework and machinery in ways that suggested a much larger space than the building schematics indicated. The abandoned water plant had been modified, expanded, turned into something that served purposes far removed from municipal engineering. Standing at the threshold, breathing air that tasted of copper and ozone and things best left unnamed, Judge-Marshal Vex made the decision that would haunt his remaining years of service. "We go in," he declared, checking his bolt pistol's ammunition count one final time. "The Emperor protects, and his justice will not be denied."
The stairwell descended far deeper than any municipal water facility had right to reach. Vex counted 47 steps before his auspex lost contact with the surface levels, the signal blocked by layers of reinforced rockcrete and something else, something that interfered with Imperial technology in ways that made his skin crawl. The Underhive had always been a place where the Emperor's light grew dim, but this felt different. This felt like stepping into the throat of a beast. "Air quality declining," Arbitrator Voss reported, his voice muffled by the rebreather mask they'd all donned after the atmospheric readings spiked into hazardous ranges. "Detecting trace amounts of warp-tainted particulates. Recommend we abort and call for inquisitorial support." Under normal circumstances, Vex would have agreed. When chaos corruption ran this deep, it usually meant coordinated cult activity that required specialists, inquisitors with their retinues of psychers, tech priests, and battle sisters trained specifically for purification operations. But these weren't normal circumstances. Every second they delayed meant more citizens falling to corruption, more souls damned to serve the ruinous powers. "Negative," Vex replied, his voice carrying the iron certainty that had kept him alive through 2 decades of enforcing Imperial law. "We have our duty. The Emperor judges through our actions, and we will not be found wanting." The lower levels opened into a vast space that violated every architectural principle the Imperium held sacred. Curved walls stretched away into darkness, covered in symbols that seemed to writhe when observed directly. The ceiling disappeared into shadows that felt hungry, and the floor sloped downward toward a central pit that glowed with sickly phosphorescence. "Throne of Earth," Thorn whispered, her combat shotgun tracking across impossible geometries. "Judge-Marshal, this place, it's not right. The walls are curved, but my auspex says they're straight. The distance readings don't match what I'm seeing." I understand her confusion. The abandoned water plant had been transformed into something that followed the warped physics of chaos rather than the rational engineering of the Imperium. Space folded in on itself, distances became negotiable, and the very air whispered promises that no loyal servant of the Emperor should hear. They advanced in formation through the nightmare architecture, boots splashing through puddles that reflected lights from sources that weren't there. The gangers had vanished completely, but their presence lingered in the form of abandoned equipment and defensive positions that suggested they'd been preparing this place for weeks, possibly months. "Motion sensors are going crazy," Kane reported, his riot gun sweeping across angles that hurt to contemplate. "I'm getting contacts everywhere, but visual confirmation shows nothing." "Trust your training, not your instruments," Vex commanded. "Down here, technology lies. Your eyes lie. Only faith in the Emperor and adherence to protocol will see us through." As if summoned by his words, the first wave of corrupted gangers emerged from the shadows. But these weren't the disciplined fighters they'd faced above. These were things that had once been human, twisted by exposure to warp energies into forms that defied classification. Extra limbs sprouted from torsos, faces split open to reveal rows of predatory teeth, and their movements flowed with the liquid grace of creatures born in a nightmare. Mordek met the charge with his suppression shield, the blessed ceramitite holding firm against claws that could shred steel. His shock maul crackled as it connected with corrupted flesh, and the resulting scream echoed in frequencies that made the arbitrator's bones ache.
These things felt pain, but they gloried in it, drawing strength from suffering in ways that violated every natural law. "Execution arounds, sustained fire," Vex ordered, his built pistol booming as mass-reactive shells tore through mutated torsos. The corrupted gangers died hard, some continuing to fight even with fatal wounds, driven by unholy energies that refused to let them acknowledge death. Thorn's combat shotgun proved devastatingly effective at close range, each blast removing chunks of corrupted anatomy with surgical precision. But for every mutant that fell, 2 more seemed to emerge from the impossible shadows, and Vex realized they weren't fighting a gang anymore. They were fighting an infestation. "Fall back to defensive positions," he commanded. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew retreat was no longer an option. The stairmill they descended had vanished, replaced by a curved wall covered in symbols that pulsed with their own malevolent light. The trap had closed around them with mechanical precision, and somewhere in the phosphorescent darkness ahead, something vast and hungry was stirring to wakefulness.
The thing that had once been the gang leader emerged from the phosphorescent pit like a fever dream given flesh. What Vex had mistaken for simple chaos corruption above ground had been merely the beginning of a transformation that violated every principle of human anatomy. The creature stood 3 meters tall on legs that bent in too many places, its torso split open to reveal a writhing mass of tentacles where organs should have been. But it was the head that confirmed Vex's worst fears. Still recognizably human, still wearing the rank insignia of an Imperial Guard sergeant, but with eyes that burned with the cold fire of the warp itself. "Citizens of the Imperium," the thing spoke, its voice a harmony of screams that bypassed the ears and carved directly into their minds. "You have served the Corpse Emperor faithfully, but faithfulness is not enough. Down here, in the spaces between reality, we serve newer gods, hungrier gods." Arbitrator Kane opened fire without hesitation, his riot gun booming in the confined space. Mass reactive shells punched through the creature's torso, spraying ichor that hissed where it touched the floor. The thing looked down at its wounds with what might have been amusement, watching as the holes sealed themselves with writhing flesh that grew back stronger than before. "Blessed ammunition ineffective," Thorn reported with professional calm, though Vex could hear her strain in her voice. "Recommend immediate withdrawal and orbital bombardment." "No withdrawal," Vex replied, drawing his ceremonial power sword, a blade that had been blessed by the ecclesiarchy and inscribed with wards against the unholy. "This corruption ends here, or it spreads throughout the entire hive." The transformed sergeant laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with dying children. "Your Emperor's light barely reaches these depths, Judge-Marshal, but our patron's gifts are infinite. Join us willingly, and your transformation will be pleasurable." Around the central pit, more corrupted gangers were emerging, but these weren't desperate street criminals Vex had expected to find there. These were Imperial citizens, factory workers, administrative clerks, even what looked like a junior tech priest, all bearing the marks of willing corruption. Their conversions weren't forced mutations, but voluntary embraces of chaos, each one a small betrayal that weakened the Imperial's hold on reality itself. "How many?" Vex asked, though he already knew the answer would damn him. "Thousands," the thing replied with obvious relish. "We are the alternative to your Emperor's grinding oppression. We offer transformation instead of stagnation, pleasure instead of duty, power instead of servitude. Every day more citizens see the truth of our gifts." Mordak charged with his suppression shield raised, shock maul crackling with sanctified energy. The corrupted sergeant met his rush with inhuman speed, tentacles wrapping around the arbitrator's weapon arm while claws raked across blessed ceramite. Where the creature's touch lingered, the armor began to corrode, sacred protective wards flaking away like old paint. "Contact toxin detected," Mordak reported through gritted teeth, even as his training kept him fighting despite the spreading corruption.
armor integrity compromised, switching to close combat protocols. Vex activated his power sword, the blade igniting with crackling energy fields that cast harsh shadows across the curved walls. But as he moved to support Mordak, the corrupted citizens closed in from all sides. These weren't mindless mutants driven by hunger. These were tactical fighters who remembered their Imperial training and used it in service of the ruinous powers. A former PDF trooper flanked left with textbook precision, while a corrupted tech priest activated mechanodendrites that sparked with unholy energy. They fought with coordination that spoke of careful planning, and Vex realized this wasn't just an outbreak of chaos corruption. This was an organized cult cell that had been operating in the Underhive for months, possibly years. "Judge-Marshal!" Thorn called out, her combat shotgun cycling through different ammunition types as she tried to find something effective against enemies that regenerated from blessed rounds. "Whatever ritual they're conducting, it's not finished. The pit is still growing." Vex spun a glance toward the phosphorescent glow and felt his blood turn to ice. The pit was indeed expanding, reality warping around its edges as something vast pressed against the barriers between realms. The corrupted gangers weren't just serving chaos, they were opening a gateway, turning the abandoned water plant into a beachhead for demonic incursion. Still with us in the darkness? Hit that like button if this tale of corruption and duty chills your soul. The transformed sergeant's laughter echoed through the chamber as more tentacles emerged from its split torso, each one tipped with sensory organs that track the arbitrator's movements with predatory focus. "You cannot stop what has already begun, servants of the Imperium dying. Reality itself bends to our will down here." Vex raised his power sword and felt the weight of 23 years of service. 23 years of dispensing the Emperor's justice to those who defy Imperial law. But this was beyond law, beyond justice, beyond anything his training had prepared him for. This was war.
The war began not with a battle cry, but with a prayer. As the corrupted sergeant lunged, tentacles whipping through the air with the crack of a sonic boom, Judge-Marshal Vex met the charge with his power sword and the litany of absolution. The words were a weapon as potent as the blade itself, a focus of faith that made the warping air around the creature shimmer with resistance. "I am the instrument of his will. I am the judgment of the golden throne." The power sword carved through a grasping tentacle, the blessed energy field causing the severed limb to dissolve into foul-smelling smoke. The creature recoiled, its many eyes blinking in a discordant rhythm of pain and surprise. Faith, it seemed, was a variable its new gods had not fully accounted for. "Thorn, the cultists, suppress them. Mordak, with me, we break the anchor point." Vex's orders cut through the psychic cacophony. He had seen the tactical reality in a flash of grim insight. The transformed sergeant was not the true threat. It was a conduit, a focal point for the energy swirling around the growing pit. The real enemy was the ritual itself. Arbitrator Mordak, his armor now pitted and corroded but his resolve unbroken, slammed his suppression shield into the creature's leg. The impact was like striking a tree trunk, but it gave Vex the opening he needed. He drove his sword deep into the thing's torso, aiming for the core of the mutation. The scream that erupted was not of this world, a wave of psychic force that threw Vex back several feet and made the very stone beneath them tremble. While Vex and Mordak engaged the monstrosity, Thorn, Kane, and Voss turned their wrath upon the encircling cultists. The dynamic had shifted. No longer were they attempting to subdue or even just execute Imperial citizens who had fallen from grace. They were purging. Thorn's combat shotgun switched to solid slug, each round aimed with cold precision at heads and chests, destroying the physical vessels with extreme prejudice.
Kane and Voss fought back to back, their riot guns creating a killing zone that the cultists, for all their fervor, could not penetrate. They died by the dozen, but for every one that fell, another seemed to step out of the distorted shadows, their chants rising to a fever pitch, feeding the power of the ritual. "The portal is stabilizing!" Voch yelled over the din of gunfire and screams. Through the haze of smoke and warping light, Vex could see it too. The phosphorescent pit was no longer just a glow. It was becoming a window. Shapes moved within it, monstrous, impossible silhouettes that promised an eternity of torment. The tension builds, subscribed to witness the final stand against the encroaching darkness. Vex parried a clawed strike that would have decapitated him, the force of the blow numbing his arm to the elbow. He was a veteran of 1,000 Underhive brawls, but this was a fight on a spiritual plane as much as a physical one. Every moment he spent in this corrupted space felt like a drain on his very soul. The whispers at the edge of his hearing promised power, release, an end to the endless grinding duty. He understood now how citizens fell. The temptation to just let go, to embrace the madness, was a seductive poison. He crushed the thought with the hammer of discipline. He was Adeptus Arbites. He was the law. "Mordek, now!" Vex shouted. Understanding his Judge-Marshal's intent, Mordek bellowed a curse and threw his entire weight forward, sacrificing his balance to slam his suppression shield into the creature once more. This time, he didn't try to strike. He pushed. With a grunt of immense strain, muscles bulging against his compromised armor, he forced the abomination back a single, crucial step toward the edge of the pit. The creature, off balance, flailed its remaining tentacles. It was the moment Vex needed. He didn't aim to kill it. He knew that might be impossible here, in the heart of its power. He aimed to banish it. With a final, prayer-filled roar, he swung his power sword in a blazing arc, not at the creature, but at the warped ground at its feet. The energy field interacted violently with the unstable reality, triggering a localized implosion. The world tore open, not the demonic gateway the cultists desired, but a violent rupture in the fabric of the ritual. The corrupted sergeant screamed as raw, unfiltered warp energy erupted around it, no longer channeled and controlled. The thing that had been a man was pulled back into the seething, chaotic void of the pit, its form unraveling into screaming ectoplasm. A deafening silence fell, broken only by the hiss of Vex's power sword and the ragged breaths of the surviving arbitrators. The phosphorescent glow of the pit faded to a dull red. The gateway had collapsed. But the victory was momentary. The collapse of the ritual had not cleansed the taint, it had merely unleashed it. Without the focal point to contain it, the accumulated warp energy began to bleed uncontrollably into the chamber. The walls wept blood. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and burning flesh. The remaining cultists, their minds shattered by the feedback, either fell to the ground convulsing or turned on each other with animalistic fury. Judge-Marshal Vex stood panting, his armor scorched and dented, his power sword's energy field flickering weakly. He looked at his squad. Mordek was on one knee, his armor smoking from the corrosive touch. Thorn was methodically ejecting spent shells from her shotgun, her eyes scanning the madness that had replaced the coordinated attack. Kane and Voss stood back to back, their riot guns creating a killing zone that the cultists, for all their fervor, could not penetrate.
The silence that followed the sergeant's banishment was a lie. It was not an absence of sound, but a pressure, a psychic aftershock that vibrated in the teeth and bones. The corrupted space, denied its intended purpose, was now a festering wound in reality. The remaining cultists were no longer a coordinated threat. They were pitiable wretches, their minds incinerated by the ritual's backblast. They clawed at their own faces, babbled in tongues that bled from their lips, or simply rocked back and forth, their souls already forfeit to the madness they had courted. "Status report," Vex commanded, his voice hoarse but firm, a rock in the swirling chaos. He deactivated his failing power sword, the blade dying with a pathetic sputter. It had served its purpose. "Mordek, moderate corrosion on the left pauldron and vombrace, systems at 80%. The big arbitrator grunted, rising to his feet. The ceramite on his arm was pitted and bubbling, but the armor's integrity was mostly intact. "Thorn, ammunition at 20%, no injuries. Kane, functional. Voss, functional. Auspex is a snowstorm of gibberish, Judge-Marshal. Navigational data is corrupted. The way we came in, it's gone." Vex nodded, his enhanced autosenses scanning the chamber. The curved walls seemed to pulse with a sickly internal rhythm. The exit had not just been blocked, it had been unmade. They were in a bubble of corrupted space, adrift in the Underhive. Standard extraction protocols were meaningless. Their only way out was to forge a new one, to cut their way back into the same universe through sheer force of will and firepower. "Then we make a new door," Vex stated, drawing his bolt pistol. "The Emperor's light does not retreat, it advances. We will advance, straight through this heresy, until we stand once more under the light of the Hive's lumens." Their advance was a grim procession through a landscape of the damned. The corridors they now traversed were not the same ones they had entered. The geometry was fluid, nonsensical. A hallway would stretch for 100 meters, then end abruptly in a solid wall of weeping rock. A left turn would somehow lead them back to the chamber with the fading pit. The air resisted them, becoming thick as water, carrying whispers that promised rest, power, and an end to their struggle. They encountered things that were once human, now warped into ambulatory horrors by the uncontrolled warp bleed. A creature with too many mouths, all screaming in harmony, scrambled across the ceiling. A floating mass of fused bodies, a single eye opening and closing across its surface, drifted through a wall as if it were mist. The arbitrators did not hesitate. They met each abomination with controlled, disciplined volleys. Thorn's shotgun boomed, Kane and Voss's riot guns barked, and Mordek's maul crackled. They were not fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for the right to remain human. "The corruption is spreading," Thorn noted, her voice tight as she reloaded. She pointed her shotgun barrel at the walls. The blasphemous graffiti was no longer static. It was slowly crawling across the surface, like veins spreading poison. "If we don't contain this, containment is beyond us now," Vex interrupted, putting a bolt round through a shambling, multi-limbed thing. "Our duty is to report. The Inquisition will need to scorch this entire sector from the Hive's spine. Our mission is to survive long enough to deliver that warning." The true test came when they reached a vast, cavernous space that had no right to exist on the schematics, a cathedral-sized chamber filled with the groaning of stressed metal and the faint, ghostly echoes of a billion prayers. In the center stood a towering, distorted effigy, a mockery of the imperial Aquila, twisted into an 8-pointed star. And kneeling before it was the corrupted tech priest they had seen earlier, his mechadendrites fused with the idol, his flesh merging with the metal floor. He was a living anchor, stabilizing the bubble of corruption, trying to rebuild what they had shattered. "There's our door," Vex said, his bolt pistol rising. "Destroy the anchor." The tech priest's head rotated 180 degrees, his human eye replaced by a pulsating red orb. A wave of psychic static washed over them, a screech of binary hatred that made their armor's systems whine in protest. Voss cried out as his helmet display flickered and died, overloaded by malicious code. Kane was forced to discard his riot gun after a mechadendrite wrapped around it, the weapon's internal mechanisms fusing into a useless lump of metal. It was Mordek who broke the deadlock. With a roar that was pure, undiluted defiance, he charged, using his suppression shield as a battering ram. He ignored the data spike that plunged into his shoulder joint, ignored the warning shrieks from his armor spirit. He slammed into the base of the twisted idol. There was a sound of screaming metal, and the tech priest howled in unison, the connection between anchor and reality faltering. "Now, Judge-Marshal, now!" Vex didn't fire his bolt pistol. He drew his combat knife, its blade inscribed with purity seals. He lunged past the flailing mechadendrites, past the psychic screeches battering his mind, and drove the knife into the tech priest's human heart. There was a final deafening shriek of tearing reality, and the world snapped back into focus with a thunderclap. The cavern was gone. They stood in a grimy, rubble-strewn sub-basement, the air thick with normal, mundane industrial smog. The twisted idol was a pile of scrapped metal and fused flesh. The tech priest was dead at their feet, just a man again, with a look of profound surprise on his face. For a long moment, no one spoke. They stood in the sudden, shocking silence of the real world, their armor scarred, their weapons nearly spent, their souls weary. They had won. They had closed the gate, slain the anchor, and clawed their way back to reality. But as Vex looked down at his dead opponent, he knew the truth. This was not a victory. It was a postponement. The cancer was still there, hidden deeper, waiting. And he had just become the only man in the hive who knew how deep it ran.
The light of the surface lumens was a pale, sickly yellow, but to Judge-Marshal Vex, it felt harsher than any star. After the absolute darkness of the corrupted deeps, even this feeble imitation of daylight was an assault. He stood at the entrance to the enforcement precinct, his black carapace armor caked with grime, ichor, and the subtle, invisible stain of the warp. The official debriefing was over. The reports had been filed, the evidence, what little they could salvage, logged and sealed with holy sigils. The higher-ups had listened with grim faces, then dismissed them with orders to await the arrival of the inquisitorial contingent. The matter was now officially above their pay grade. But Vex knew the bureaucracy of the Imperium. The Inquisition would come, eventually. They would purge the sector, yes. They would likely seal off entire sublevels and execute thousands of citizens on suspicion alone. But would they find the root? The cult had not been a mere gathering of disaffected gangers. It had been sophisticated, patient, and deeply embedded. A former guard sergeant, a tech priest. Who else? A scribe in the administratum, a foreman in the factorum. The corruption was a hydra. They had cut off one head, but the body remained, hidden in the sprawling, cancerous darkness of the hive. He watched the citizens of Hive Tertius shuffle through the crowded thoroughfares below. They were oblivious, their lives a cycle of grinding work, scant rations, and fleeting sleep. They feared the Arbites with their shock malls in absolute authority. They feared gang violence and the brutal justice of the Imperium. But they did not fear the true enemy, the one that whispered in the darkness between shifts, that offered false promises of power and release from their suffering. They saw the Arbites as oppressors, never understanding that the black armor and the unyielding law were the only things standing between them and the howling abyss. Arbitrator Thorn stood nearby, silently cleaning her combat shotgun, her face a mask of professional detachment that barely concealed the same grim understanding. Mordek was already in the apothecarian, having the corrupted flesh around his armor burn scrubbed away by a scowling Medicae servitor. Peace was not the absence of conflict in the 41st millennium. It was a temporary, fragile state, bought with the blood of those willing to stare into the darkness so that others could live in ignorant toil. Order was not a gentle hand guiding society. It was a boot, forever stamping out the embers of heresy before they could become a conflagration that would consume worlds.
Vex and his arbitrators were not peacekeepers, they were the surgeons of a dying empire, endlessly cutting away the malignant flesh of chaos so that the body politic might live one more day. Their victory in the depths was no triumph, it was a receipt for a debt that would come due with interest in the future. He turned from the vista of the Hive, the weight of his duty heavier than his armor. There were no parades for them, no medals for surviving the hell beneath the city. There was only the next patrol, the next investigation, the next terrible secret waiting to be uncovered. The Emperor's law was absolute, and its enforcement was a war without end, a war fought in shadows against an enemy that wore a million familiar faces. Victory was measured not in territory gained, but in the simple, terrible fact that the Hive still stood, and the sun, however polluted, would rise again tomorrow. For the Adeptus Arbites, that was enough. It had to be.